Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 4.
Your Grace, Mr. Graham will not be joining the family for dinner tonight, Mr. Hawke somberly said. Mr. Price says he is taken somewhat ill and out of sorts. Out of sorts? Hannibal blandly echoed, disgusted. He waved Hawkes away, telling him, "No matter, he's contrary to good appetite." "Send him up a tray, please, Mr. Hawkes," the Duke said, settling to eat. "I had hoped to have a better meal this evening than last, but that is not to be." "Thank that overly dramatic Omega you married me off to," Hannibal said, attacking his plate with more gusto than he actually felt. "Pouting in his room, no doubt. He has little reason to be in your presence when you have behaved so terribly toward him. You have never in your life been so rude to another. That is hardly the conduct of a gentleman. There's no reason to be polite to an Omega, grandfather," Hannibal said, leveling a hard look at the Duke. "It only encourages them to take advantage. Besides which, they haven't the capacity to remember anything for very long that is unpleasant to them. If he's even half as brainless as others I've met, he'll forget we're married by morning, and my problem will be solved. And good riddance to bad rubbish, I say. That is more unkind than you are wont to be," the Duke remarked, eyeing his grandson. "I had imagined war would make you more sympathetic rather than less so." Hannibal glowered, focusing on his food, even though he hardly tasted it. He had spent an altogether unsatisfying afternoon avoiding the house and his grandfather's potential displeasure, only to return and find that his pretend spouse had retreated immediately to his suite without a word to anyone. He couldn't decide what irritated him more. The fact that he'd avoided the house all day for nothing, or the fact that Will hadn't run to his grandfather to tell tales as Hannibal had assumed he would. "Flighty little thing," he complained under his breath. Will had probably forgotten all about it already and gone back to his room to play dress-up. Why is he dressed in male clothing now? The Duke did not react to his apparent and strange change of subject. Instead, he told him, "Will prefers male clothing. Apparently his father armed him in his twins' clothing and sent him along with that. Anthony, fortunately, requested of the staff that they also pack Will's usual clothing so he could be more comfortable." Hannibal scowled, recalling the shabby riding clothes he'd seen earlier in the day. "It will cost a fortune to dress him." The Duke did not betray himself with a smile, merely said, "He is very small. He will not cost all that much to outfit properly." "His clothing at supper was not that worn," Hannibal said, glaring at his plate as if it had some hand in things. "Mr. Price has informed me Will's formal clothing had little use," the Duke told him, though he did not mention what else Jimmy had said about Will's threadbare and pitiful wardrobe. "I've asked Mr. Avery to come at the end of the week to measure and fit him." "Already indulging him, grandfather?" Hannibal asked, his tone nasty. "Don't think to spoil him. I'm not keeping it." "I believe you are, and I will do as I please with Will. It costs nothing to be kind, Hannibal." "It does with Omegas. Hannibal, you cannot afford to reject him," the Duke said, nearing the end of his patience with his stubborn grandson. "Even the lure of being a duchess would not be enough to tempt any good family into marrying with ours." "And why is that, pray tell?" Hannibal bit out, annoyed. "Remember, grandfather, I have been near a decade away from home." "Yes, and in that decade there has been much speculation about poor Melinda's tragic end," he was told, and Hannibal stilled at the mention of her name. Sighing softly, disliking the pain he caused his dear grandson, the Duke said, "You fled to the military the day she died, Hannibal. You did not even stay for the funeral." "I had little reason to," Hannibal said, returning to his meal with such stiff dignity it was almost painful to witness. "She was already gone." "According to society gossips, you had every reason to leave," the Duke said, sipping his wine with caution. "And your haste lent credence to their supposition. It is generally accepted, Hannibal, that you are the cause of Melinda's death." Hannibal abruptly stiffened and looked away, a muscle in his jaw jumping with tension. "Despite my attempts to handle the situation quietly, the rumors still abound, and they have greatly limited your potential matches. We are lucky House Reddick was contractually obligated to provide you with Will. You have precious few prospects otherwise. Had you not married so hastily to avoid it in the first place, you and that damned contract," Hannibal said, shaking his head. It plagued me then, and it plagues me now. I will not deal with him, grandfather, necessary evil or not, and you would do well not to press the matter." In the face of his rising and unpredictable temper, the Duke quite wisely did not continue. They spoke instead of the changes in the village and the future of Hertford House, all while avoiding the inevitable truth of another generation added to the line of succession. Pleading weariness, the Duke forewent after dinner brandy and retired to his room, sending for Jimmy with near immediacy. The pleasant and bright young man arrived in due time, all smiles as was usual for him, and absolutely delighted to help however he could. "How is Will?" the Duke asked without preamble. He had very specifically assigned Jimmy to Will in the full knowledge that he would inform him of Will's needs without sacrificing discretion. Jimmy hesitated, cocking his head slightly and looking off to the side as he searched for words. "Your Grace, he's grieving, I think would be the best word." "Did you tell what happened?" "No, your Grace. He went out riding this morning and came back rather sooner than I expected, white as a ghost, and refused to say anything. He went straight up to his suite and hasn't come out since." The Duke heaved a sigh and said, "Hannibal rides in the mornings." "Oh, I had no idea, your Grace, else I would have dissuaded Mr. Graham. It was no fault of yours or his," the Duke said, scowling at the unpleasantness that occurred with every interaction of his grandson and his spouse. "Did he eat?" "I could only get him to eat a little," Jimmy said, wringing his hands. "Your Grace, I hesitate to say it, but I believe Will was more mistreated at his father's house than we knew." "Mistreated?" the Duke echoed, eyes sharpening. "In what ways?" "I have no desire to betray his confidence, your Grace," Jimmy said, ever vigilant of his charge, which was why the Duke had chosen him. "Just, please, understand that he was neglected to an alarming degree and dealt with far more harshly than any child his age I've ever met, especially considering his family's position." The Duke heaved a sigh, fondly saying, "So, in other words, Jimmy, do my best to keep Hannibal's sharp tongue between his teeth. I would never presume. Presume, Jimmy, always presume. I want no further harm coming to William here. I do, however, want a great-grandchild sooner rather than later." "Yes, your Grace," Jimmy said, nodding. "I received your message, of course. Would you like me to talk to him tonight?" "I think you'd better. Hannibal is an alpha in the end. It should take very little to fan a flame between them." "Very well, your Grace. I'll see what I can do," Jimmy said, and quit the room when the Duke nodded at him. He only hoped that it went as he wished, and not as he knew it could go, given Hannibal's terrible temper. All he could do now was wait. Will was hardly aware of the time when Jimmy finally came to dress him for bed. He was surprised to see his valet arrive, and even more surprised by the darkness beyond the windows. "The Duke asked me to discuss something with you." Will struggled to pay attention to Jimmy speaking as he was dressed for bed. He'd been fighting a strange numbness all day that had finally overtaken him. Now that it had, he wished he'd given in earlier, because it certainly felt better than the raw, aching disgrace of his own personal truth, that everything his father had said about him was true. "Mr. Graham?" I'm sorry, Jimmy, what?" he asked, his voice faint. "I said the Duke has asked me to discuss something with you," Jimmy repeated, helping Will into a pair of light linen pants that he'd preferred to sleep in. "It's rather personal, so I want you to know it's all right to be embarrassed, okay?" Will felt his stomach clench in response, empty and tight. "Okay, so, here, have a seat," Jimmy said, settling Will on his bed and sitting next to him. "So, has your father ever talked to you about intimacy?" Will's cheeks bloomed with heat as he shook his head, speechless with shock and horror. "I figured not," Jimmy said, sympathetic. "Well, let me give you a little crash course, okay? So, you know about alphas and how omegas are made to fit them?" Will nodded. He was vague on the details, but he figured he knew enough to get by. "Well, truth of the matter is, an alpha finds it rather difficult to resist an omega under certain circumstances, especially one like yourself, unmated near your first heat," Jimmy said, his easy manner of speaking keeping things from being too painfully upsetting. "What the Duke would like, Mr. Graham, is for you to go to his grandson and let nature take its course, so to speak." Will blinked. "What?" The Duke wants you to do everything you can to get Hannibal to claim you, Jimmy said, squeezing his hand in something like sympathy. He's going by the once-bitten law and all, hoping that his grandson will mark you and settle after the fact. Hannibal hates me, Jimmy, Will said, his voice cracking when he thought of the things Hannibal had said to him. He hadn't spoken of it to anyone, refusing to confess to how unacceptable he honestly was, but he was willing to say that much. The Duke is hopeful he'll indulge in what you're offering, and that the two of you will prove to be compatible. He sent me personally to ask you to, please, try, at least. But I don't know what to do, Will said, anguished, heart pounding at even the idea of what it meant. Just let nature take its course, Jimmy said, patting his shoulder gently. He looked like he didn't believe a word he was saying, and that only made Will's stomach plunge harder. Will swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the door. He couldn't imagine Hannibal ever looking at him with anything other than disgust. Yet he clearly recalled that his father enjoyed humiliating him, took no little relish in causing him pain. Surely after his show of force this morning, such an overture on Will's part would elicit a similar reaction. Perhaps a humiliating, painful coupling would be preferable to Hannibal, a suitable substitute for the kindness and closeness Will had so stupidly dreamed he might find here. Just try, Jimmy said, gentle with him, as if he might shatter like a teacup dropped on the floor. It's all he asks. I can hardly deny the Duke a request, Will said, the words thready with fear, a fine tremble coursing through him. Taking a deep breath to brace himself, Will got to his feet and slowly made his way to meet his fate. Hannibal had no sooner settled into an armchair before the fireplace in his room with a snifter of brandy and a good book than he heard a soft knock at his door. Eyes narrowing, he put the book down and called, "Enter." A pale, small form moved quietly into his room in a waft of sweet scent. It was Will. Of course it was Will. Hannibal's mouth curled in sardonic humor when he saw him, every Omegan aspect of him working overtime to enhance his appeal. He was wearing only a pair of linen pants that exposed the slender sweep of his belly and the hollows of his hip bones. His arms were crossed in front of him, hands clasped at his shoulders, and his head down in a mockery of shyness. Hannibal could see faint lines on his skin, shinier than the white skin around them, but he could not make sense of them in the shadows. "What do you want?" he asked, though he knew. Of course he knew. It had finally occurred to Will at long last that if he consummated their marriage, then Hannibal couldn't have it annulled, or otherwise be rid of him without a lengthy, embarrassing scandal. Will took a few steps forward, toes curling with nerves, white limbs shaking as he moved into the firelight. Even the scent of him working towards seduction, despite its underlying tang of fear. Indeed, the tang of fear was only a spice, making the scent of his more alluring. Hannibal laughed, tapering to a sigh, watching Will's blue eyes chase the room from corner to corner, from ceiling to floor, anywhere and everywhere but at the man he'd come to bed. "I already told you, I despise what you are," Hannibal murmured, watching a shudder course through him that was eloquent of shame. It pleased him to see atonement for being what he was, mortification. Yet here you are, unable to resist your nature, armed and ready with Omegan wiles, to do what you creatures do best. Will's hands fisted at his shoulders. He swallowed hard but said nothing. Hannibal could scent the faint salt of unshed tears, and felt a sudden desire to shake them free, to sharpen the smell of fear and panic that rode just beneath his desperation. "What do you plan to do, Will? Strip before me and hope I'll be overcome? Trust in your deceitful nature and pray for the best? My grandfather contracted yours for a wife. Instead he gives me you, a construct of meager appeal, housing a vapid, empty mind, and lack of true purpose, outside of getting bedded. I want a partner in life, not something else that demands more of my attention than I can spare." Will hung his head and took a deep breath before softly saying, "I can give you an heir." "I don't want one from you." Hannibal quickly overrode him, leaning forward in his chair to scrutinize his trembling spouse. "I cannot, in fact, think of anything I want less than the possibility of you giving me something exactly like yourself, Will, ruled by heats and impulses, needing an alpha for every little decision, unable and unwilling to lift a hand to save itself because its very nature requires its dependence on something stronger and better than itself. I'd feel compelled to drown it at birth rather than sentence it to live in such a demeaning and debasing way." Will flinched, arms dropping to cross protectively over his belly, as if Hannibal's threat might somehow be heard within by a child yet undreamed of. "Your father should have been so kind," Hannibal told him, and turned his attention back to the fire, dimly aware that the alcohol was making him much crueler than he had a right to be. "You are vile to me, disgusting. Get out, out of my sight, out of my house. Out!" There was a soft, near soundless whisper of feet on the carpet, the mute thud of footsteps pattering lightly over the wooden floor, and the carefully quiet click of the door to Will's sweet closing. Hannibal looked back at the space where he'd been, and drew in a breath damp with his spouse's salty tears. Even he could admit he'd been much harsher than he should have been, considering Will's tender age, but the hard, ugly coil of resentment inside of him refused to be sorry for it. He reached for the brandy bottle and poured himself a steeper drink, staring into the fire with sightless eyes, his thoughts on his father's concubine and how thoroughly she had destroyed his entire life, as easily and thoughtlessly as Will would, if given his way. He tossed back his drink and grimly imagined how different his world would be if there were no such things as revolting Omegas. "My lord, the Duke wishes to see you immediately." It wasn't the first thing Hannibal wished to hear in the morning, but he wasn't surprised. Will had probably fled directly to grandfather last night, eager to bear tales of Hannibal's cruelty. "Is he up already?" Hannibal asked, flinging back the covers and emerging to the cool air, while Berger stirred up the fire. He stretched, yawning, brushing his hair back from his face. "He is, my lord," Berger said. "The shaving water's ready." "Thank you, Berger, I'll do it myself," Hannibal said, already annoyed that his day would be so disturbed. This had not been the homecoming he'd wanted, and it irritated him that the Omega was causing friction in his family. If only they'd done the sensible thing and chosen a wife for him, a proper wife. Even as a grandson and heir, Hannibal was not at liberty to keep the Duke waiting. He made short work of shaving, bathing, dressing, and took himself to his grandfather's study, unconsciously seeking the sweet scent of his spouse, only aware of what he was doing when he realized it was particularly absent. He knocked to announce himself, and entered when the Duke called out. Without preamble, he seated himself in front of his grandfather's desk, and blandly said, "Berger informs me you wish to speak with me." The Duke was pale with quiet fury, something Hannibal hadn't seen since he'd been very young, and his father had managed to incense him. He pushed a paper across his desk to Hannibal, who took it up with a frown to peruse it. What on earth is this, grandfather?" he asked, growing livid when he read the contents, which gave full and legal ownership of Hertford House to none other than Will Graham. "Incentive," Roland answered, his voice as hard and sharp as Hannibal's own, his anger palpable. "After last night, I feel compelled to offer Will some form of compensation for what I've done to him." "For what he's done to himself," Hannibal reminded him, hand tightening on the damning paper. "This cannot be correct, grandfather. Have you any idea of what you've written?" "I'm quite aware of what is written there, Hannibal, as I wrote it this morning. If you cannot restrain yourself from ordering your spouse from Hertford House, then I will make a gift of it to him." Hannibal stared at him, outraged and disbelieving, then laughing with scorn. "Ha ha! I see! So the little minx ran straight from my bedchamber to yours, and no doubt listed the various ways in which I rejected him. To the contrary, he was nearly a quarter of the way to his father's estate before he could be overtaken and returned," the Duke said, cold fury sparkling in his amber eyes, "and only said, upon hard pressing, he was ordered out of the house, and lacking anywhere else to go, he wished to return to his father." Hannibal was silent for a moment, wondering how the Omega had managed to, yet again, pass on a chance to reveal his behavior. "You should have let him," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "I don't want him. He is entirely unappealing to me in every respect, and I wish to be shed of him. I am the head of this family," the Duke reminded him. "You are my heir, and as such will do as I tell you for the best of our line. To that end, Hannibal, this agreement stands. Hertford House will belong to William Gran in its entirety. The only way in which you regain control of this estate is by fathering an alpha son on him, at which time I will have the order rescinded. Those are my terms, and as I am an old man, I expect you should get started rather quickly."
Hannibal stared at him, aghast that the home which had housed the lectors from time immemorable would be given part and parcel to that interloper for no good reason he could see. "Will Graham is an accepted part of this family, Hannibal," the Duke said, grave and angry. "There will be no annulment, no dissolution of this joining. I want a child of his line. Indeed, I want several, including Omegas, and if I have to strip you of Hertford House in order to get them, so be it." Hannibal frowned, reining in his temper with difficulty. In a quiet, dangerous voice he asked, "Why do you persist in this, grandfather? What manner of spell has he cast that you cannot turn loose of him?" "I am solely concerned with the continuance of the Lecter line," grandfather reminded him. "Will Graham's breeding is impeccable, and he is rich in his own right, or will you turn your nose up at the dowry he arrived with? There is no viable reason not to pursue this except for your petty refusal to see him as the person he is, rather than what you perceive him to be." Hannibal put the paper back down on the desk, chewing his lower lip with anger, fair trembling with it. "There is another way that I am hopeful you will not insist on," grandfather said, taking the paper back. "And what is that, pray tell? Please don't underestimate my desire to be rid of that thing, grandfather." "The other option, of course, is to make Anthony my heir," Roland said, freezing Hannibal's blood in his veins with outrage. "He was your proxy in marriage to Will, and would have no qualms becoming Duke in my stead. They deal very well together, and will, no doubt, make charming children. It would be simple to amend the documents to remove the proxy from them." Hannibal just stared at him in disbelief. With quiet shock he clarified. "So, I am either disinherited in part or in full on the whim of an Omega. Hannibal," grandfather sharply said, reminding him that though aged he was a fierce alpha in his own right. "Do you believe me so feeble that I lose my sense in the presence of an Omega young enough to be my own great-grandchild? If you cannot bring yourself to understand that Will hasn't a cruel or manipulative bone in his body, then trust in my judgment." "I trust in your judgment, grandfather," Hannibal growled, standing and straightening his jacket. "Then what will you do?" "Pack!" Hannibal snarled, stalking from the room and shouting over his shoulder. "You can insist that creature have this house, but you cannot insist I stay here. If he stays, then I will go. Hannibal!" Fuming, Hannibal stomped up the stairs, roaring for Berger to pack his things, his mind a white-hot flare of anger that refused to be swayed.